topics of conversation that most of us avoid at the family picnic or the neighborhood cocktail party because we've been burned before when we brought them up. Politics, religion, and your opinion of my clothing choices are topics generally avoided in polite company. I suppose there are times when certain people are perceived to be too hot to handle as well. Someone may be in a bad mood or going through something in their lives that threatens us or that we don't want to rub off on us, and we find them too hot to handle. What about God? Do you ever find God too hot to handle? I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let me back up just a bit. I've raised this question because of the rather troubling story that Michelle read to us this morning in today's Hebrew reading. It starts out, normally enough, with a politician David namely, trying to solidify his power. That's a story that we're all too familiar with. David, king of the newly unified nation of Israel, decided to establish a new capital city, Jerusalem, in between the two former kingdoms being brought together, the kingdoms of Judah and Israel. And in order to add more legitimacy to his rule, David thought it would be more expedient to move the Ark of the Covenant, or the chest of God, as the Message translation renders it, to move this box to this new capital city. You see, the Ark of the Covenant, which has been made famous in recent years by Indiana Jones, was a box of acacia wood overlaid with gold and with 4 rings at the corners so holes could be inserted and the box, which was rather large, could be carried on the backs of 2 people. Inside the gilded wooden box were the tablets of the law given to Moses, which we know as the 10 Commandments. On top of the ark was a mercy seat, also overlaid with gold, like a throne, at either end of which sat a cherub, a winged creature, which was kind of an amalgam of a lion and an eagle. The seat symbolized the throne of God. Because you see, the Hebrews believed that God was fully present in this box, so that they could literally carry God with them wherever they went. We moderns, of course, being more highly evolved, know better than that, don't we? We understand that the fullness of God can't be contained in a mere box, don't we? Or do we? What about our tendency to box God up into ideological packages that fit our own agendas, whether they be liberal or conservative agendas? What about our tendency to domesticate God to fit our need for safety and the affirmation of our own culture's lifestyles and ways? Enough of modernity. I think I'm ready to go back to the ancient story. After all, it does get really juicy now. A bit bizarre even. You see, as the Hebrew armies were transporting the God box to Jerusalem, the ox cart on which it happened to be being transported at the time, I guess the 2 guys were tired, the ox cart upset. And the God box started to slide off one end of the cart. And Uzzah, bless his heart, one of the guardians in charge of the God box, instinctively reaches out to stabilize it, and in doing so, is struck dead on the spot, according to the story. Now, lest we think God was acting in a completely arbitrary fashion, there were rules about the care of the God box, including a rule that clearly stated that nobody was supposed to touch it. That was presumably because God's holiness, the holiness of God's presence, was so overwhelming that really death would be a natural consequence of coming in direct contact with it. Now, if even with this interpretation you still feel a bit queasy, if not outright terrified by God's response here, you're not alone. I, for one, am horrified. I personally don't believe for a minute that God would do such a thing to poor, unsuspecting Uzzah, who, after all, was only trying to lend a hand. I think that this is where ancient notions of God lose credibility in the face of the loving God that we have come to know in the person of Jesus. However, I do think the ancients have a point here that is worth our consideration. When we behave as though we have God in a box of our own making, we're asking for trouble. We're probably going to get it. The Hebrew people named that spot where the box fell Perez Uzzah, which means the explosion against Uzzah. It was a reminder to them and to us that God is sometimes too hot to handle. In saying that, I don't mean to imply that God is not the loving, healing, grace-filled God that we know in Jesus. But I do mean to say that God is not our pet. God is not to be domesticated for our own purposes. Just as God gave each of us freedom at our own creating, we must respect the freedom of God to be whom God will be. And just who is God for you and for me. When we compare our faith and ritual with that of ancient Israel, does it seem that we have tried to tame God? Has God become a nice, friendly, predictable companion whose job it is to comfort us and to offer us rewards for our good behavior and our regular attendance at church? And I actually want to support that. Or is this God of David, this God of the people of Israel, more like the free and surprising God of Annie Dillard when she writes, "Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It is madness. Madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews." What if we came to be in the presence of a God like that on Sunday morning? Friends, good worship is not about trying to get a handle on God. Worship at its best is letting God out of the boxes we have tried to put God in. Worship is about coming together to share our individual experiences of God in a way that expands our communal experience of God, not narrows and diminishes it. This lovingly wild and unpredictable God who will surprise us with newness at every turn if we will but let go of the reins long enough for the Spirit to move in and among us. A relationship with such a lovingly wild God can, I think, be frightening at times when we are challenged to step out of our comfort zones and make relationships with persons of other races or live among the poor poor, to put oneself in another person's shoes. But such a relationship with our lovingly wild God is also life-giving beyond measure, as we are invited and urged to grow in our capacity to imagine and embrace a world that becomes ever more loving and just and flourishing. Sometimes being in a relationship with this God who is too hot to handle can even make us too hot to handle. My friend Cynthia Winton Henry is a UCC pastor who has a passion for dance and embodied spirituality. She's actually one of the founders of Interplay, which we have played with a little bit in our worship services. But sometimes folks in our disembodied culture are not ready to hear about bringing the fullness of ourselves, including our bodies, to church. She wrote, or has written in her memoir, what do you do if you hear voices or see things? As an American woman with plenty of common sense, I'll tell you what you should do. You should shut up. However, if there are voices that prod you to quench the thirst for big human needs like love and justice and freedom, you might become a blabbermouth performance artist like me. You might try to demystify dance, healing rituals, and communal peacemaking enough to wave a flag in the sight of the mainstream. So why go on about this? Because I believe that it is our own weird lives that lead to answers needed for a world in dire shape. I think we need to reclaim our wisest magic, not the huff and zap kind, but the kind that employs imagination to attract solutions when nothing else works. In my case, she says, dancing, improvising, and seeing things, and listening to the wisdom of my body has shown me how to accelerate peace and grace in a world that dances all too vigorously, too mechanically, too violently. I've seen peace born between two people who bring their hand together with a partner's hand in an extemporaneous, experimental 2-minute hand dance. The big challenge is creating a society that is willing to bet its future on such practices. Usually, it's only the desperate who are open to radically simple and crazy ideas. The poor, the sick, the imprisoned, women, the disabled, the oppressed, visionaries in developing countries, people of color, the usual revolutionary suspects. But maybe there's hope for us all, I think, even the powerful. The wild and impractical voice of love, my friends, is just that compelling. Cynthia's words call to my mind King David. King David dancing round that Ark of the Covenant, ancient Israel's God box. I wonder if dancing is really not the most adequate response to this God who is just too hot to handle. Perhaps if we stop trying so hard to get hold of this mystifying God, and instead let God energy flow through our bodies in dance, we'd have a better sense of how to flow ourselves with this wild, unpredictably loving God. This God who will not be boxed in. This God who will not stand still. This God who will not stop moving in unpredictably just and loving ways, until all the world is full of the Spirit Spirit's energy, this Spirit's life. May it be so. Amen.